At the dawn of the 20th century, the British Empire stood at a height no polity had ever reached. A quarter of the globe's land surface fell beneath its rule, and nearly 1 in 4 human beings lived under its flag. The red-stained world map was not merely cartographic ornament. It was the record of centuries of conquest, commerce, and naval supremacy. Yet within the lifetime of a single generation, that empire would recede, unraveling with a speed that astonished even those who had long predicted its decline. A nation that had once dictated terms to continents was, by mid-century, struggling to feed its own people, indebted to allies, and forced to watch former colonies claim independence in rapid succession. This staggering rise and collapse poses a central question. How did a small, rain-swept island in the North Atlantic come to dominate the globe, and why did its supremacy dissolve so quickly? Before we follow that story step by step, let me pause here to invite you into this journey. If you are fascinated by the turning points of empires, I encourage you to subscribe, and let me know in the comments where in the world you are watching from. Because this is not just Britain's story, it is the shared history of all peoples who lived under its shadow. The paradox of Britain's empire lies at its origin. Unlike Spain, whose empire in the 16th century was born of conquests backed by immense flows of New World silver, or Portugal, whose trading posts spanned Africa, India, and the Pacific decades before Elizabethan England dreamed of such reach. The English crown in the mid-16th century presided over a realm that was comparatively poor, internally divided, and militarily fragile. In 1558, when Elizabeth I ascended the throne, England's navy counted barely a few dozen ships, and her kingdom was dwarfed in wealth and manpower by France and Spain. The island's survival depended less on force of arms than on playing continental rivals against one another. That England would, within a century, become a naval power capable of challenging Spain's Atlantic monopoly seemed improbable to contemporaries. The transformation was gradual and born from necessity. England could not match continental armies on land, so it turned to the sea. Privateers such as Francis Drake harassed Spanish treasure fleets, siphoning wealth from Iberian dominance, while demonstrating that Spain's maritime supremacy was not unassailable. These acts of sanctioned piracy were not merely adventurous raids. They represented a pragmatic state policy. Elizabeth's treasury was chronically underfunded, and her ability to finance defense relied on sharing the risks of war with private investors. Thus, the early empire was built less by armies than by chartered ventures, half state and half corporate. The test came in 1588, when Philip II of Spain launched the Armada against England. The Spanish fleet carried not only soldiers but the expectation of Catholic reconquest. England's survival hung in the balance. The Armada's defeat, a consequence of nimble English ships, logistical missteps, and destructive storms, was a turning point. Spain remained a giant, but the illusion of invincibility was shattered. The English crown, which had invested so heavily in maritime defense, could now credibly claim that the Channel could be defended by ships rather than walls. Naval strategy became the nation's lifeline, and with it the empire's future foundation. Yet naval power alone could not sustain overseas expansion. Colonies were necessary to anchor trade and provide returns to investors. The first attempts, Roanoke in the 1580s, ended in failure, underscoring how fragile these ventures were. But persistence yielded footholds. In 1607, Jamestown was established in Virginia, surviving against famine, disease, and conflict with local Powhatan tribes. 2 years earlier, in 1600, Royal Charter had created the East India Company, a joint stock enterprise whose future influence would dwarf the crown itself. These events, colonial settlement in America, corporate expansion into Asia, marked the twin poles of England's imperial trajectory. Both would grow from precarious beginnings into structures of astonishing scale. It is here, in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, that the pattern of Britain's empire first takes shape. Naval defense as shield, private capital as spear, and the crown as mediator between them. England was not unique in pursuing colonies. What set it apart was the system it forged, where national survival and mercantile expansion were fused. By the early 17th century, England was no longer a marginal island power, but an emerging maritime competitor, pressing against Spain in the Caribbean, the Portuguese in the East, and soon, the Dutch, whose fleets dominated world trade. The contrast is striking. In 1558, Elizabeth inherited a realm surrounded by stronger neighbors, its economy vulnerable to harvest failures and continental wars. By the time of her death in 1603, England possessed a navy strong enough to challenge Spanish sea lanes, colonial ventures on the Atlantic seaboard, and a corporate arm aimed at Asia. The empire's foundations were laid, though fragile and uncertain. What began as desperate improvisation in the face of continental weakness had opened a door to global expansion. And it is from this moment, the turn of the 17th century, that England's imperial trajectory truly begins. From privateers plundering galleons, it would evolve into a structured empire supported by armies, navies, and the machinery of state finance. But to see how that transition unfolded, we must trace the next stage: the Elizabethan legacy of naval defense and colonial ambition, which in the 17th century would collide with civil war at home and expansion overseas. The death of Elizabeth in 1603 closed an era of improvisation and audacity, but it did not end the trajectory she had set. Her successor, James VI of Scotland, now James I of England, inherited a kingdom that had proven the value of maritime defense and colonial ambition, yet still lacked the resources and institutional stability to transform those experiments into a durable empire. England remained a secondary power in Europe, overshadowed by France's armies and Spain's wealth. What distinguished it was the strategic orientation that Elizabeth had imprinted. The sea was not a frontier but a lifeline, and the pursuit of overseas colonies was not a luxury but a necessity. The first decades of the 17th century were marked by tentative expansion. In North America, the Virginia Company struggled to make Jamestown viable. The settlement endured staggering mortality rates. Between 1607 and 1622, of the roughly 10,000 migrants who attempted to settle, only 2,000 survived. Yet despite the human toll, tobacco cultivation gave the colony an economic foundation. The crop was not merely profitable, it was addictive, ensuring steady demand in Europe. This single commodity bound Virginia into the transatlantic economy and demonstrated that colonies could become self-sustaining engines of wealth. To the north, attempts at permanent settlement were less secure. Newfoundland, settled intermittently after 1610, was hampered by harsh climate and inadequate support. Yet its fisheries mattered. Cod from the Grand Banks supplied Catholic Europe with cheap protein, and English crews joined Portuguese, French, and Basque rivals in hauling it across the Atlantic. Here again, we see the logic of England's empire in embryo. Colonies were valued not for their populations, but for the resources they secured, whether tobacco in Virginia or fish in Newfoundland. Further south, the Caribbean lured English adventurers. Early ventures in St. Kitts, 1624, and Barbados, 1627, foreshadowed the sugar boom that would later transform the region. At first, colonists relied on indentured servants from England and Ireland, but the foundations were laid for the far more brutal system of African slavery that would, by mid-century, dominate these islands. Sugar was capital-intensive, labor-hungry, and immensely profitable, and even before it reached full scale, English investors recognized its promise. The Caribbean, though smaller in land area than continental colonies, would eventually eclipse them in economic output. If the Atlantic defined one axis of expansion, Asia defined another. The East India Company, founded by royal charter in 1600, began modestly. Its first voyages sought spices from the East Indies, where Portuguese and Dutch competition was fierce. The company's advantage was not naval power but finance. Joint stock organization allowed merchants to pool risk and capital. A single voyage might yield profits of 200%, but losses could be catastrophic. Spreading investment across many shareholders made the enterprise viable. By 1613, the company had established its first factory at Surat on India's west coast, gaining a foothold that would later expand into territorial domination. The Dutch, however, were the immediate obstacle. Having thrown off Spanish rule, the United Provinces built the world's most formidable commercial fleet. Dutch merchants under the VOC, Verenigd Oost-Indisch Company, founded 1602, seized much of the spice trade and guarded it jealously. English merchants, often humiliated in direct clashes, were forced to shift strategy. Rather than compete head-on in the East Indies, they turned toward India, where the Mughal Empire's vast markets offered an alternative. It was a recognition that English imperial strategy would succeed not by copying Iberian or Dutch models, but by exploiting gaps, securing spaces where rivals were weaker or absent. This strategic adaptation defined the 17th century. England could not dominate European battlefields, but it could insert itself into the interstices of global commerce. The defeat of the Spanish Armada had ensured survival, but survival was not supremacy. To achieve that, England needed to institutionalize its maritime system, to create fleets large enough to protect trade routes, and to sustain those fleets with steady revenue. This was the challenge of the Stuart monarchy. James I preferred peace to war, signing the Treaty of London with Spain in 1604. This reduced immediate pressure, but left the kingdom's naval establishment underfunded. The Crown's reliance on customs duties and monopolies was resented by Parliament, creating a tension between royal prerogative and mercantile interests that would eventually destabilize domestic politics. Yet even in peace, the empire grew. Colonies multiplied. Bermuda in 1609, Massachusetts by Puritan settlers in 1620, and a string of Caribbean footholds thereafter. Each was tenuous, vulnerable to disease, hunger, and indigenous resistance, but each reinforced the sense that England's destiny lay overseas. The Atlantic became not a barrier but a corridor. By mid-century, tens of thousands of English migrants had crossed it, far more than those sent by Spain in the same period. The empire was not yet secure, but it was spreading by accumulation. These developments were not isolated. They coincided with broader transformations in England's economy and society. The enclosure movement displaced rural populations, pushing landless men and women into towns and ports. The growth of London as a financial center allowed merchants to raise capital at scales unthinkable a century earlier. The Navy itself was modernized. Ship design evolved from lumbering galleons to faster, more heavily armed vessels, capable of both commerce raiding and fleet action. By the 1630s, England possessed perhaps 50 ships of war, still fewer than Spain or the Dutch, but enough to protect convoys and signal intent. What had changed since Elizabeth's time was not merely scale but direction. The empire was no longer an improvisation of privateers, but a systematic project, with colonies, companies, and a navy interlinked. And yet this system rested on fragile foundations. Royal finances strained, domestic politics unstable, colonies dependent on precarious supply lines, and the transatlantic trade increasingly tied to human bondage. The very elements that gave England reach, tobacco, sugar, slaves, and spices, would also entangle it in conflicts at home and abroad. By the mid-17th century, this fragility would be exposed. Civil war would erupt in England, shattering the crown's authority. At the same time, overseas expansion would accelerate, driven not by kings but by parliaments, companies, and generals. It was in that crucible, of war at home and conquest abroad, that England's empire would cease to be tentative and become irreversible. The next stage would see Cromwell's fleets challenge the Dutch, navigation acts tighten mercantile control, and the Caribbean colonies blossom into brutal engines of wealth. From fragile settlements and precarious ventures, a transatlantic empire was about to take shape. The first half of the 17th century had seen England plant fragile colonial outposts across the Atlantic, yet these remained precarious ventures, their fate often hinging on investors' patience and the Crown's intermittent support. What propelled them into a durable system was not royal strategy, but domestic upheaval. The English Civil War, 1642 to 1651, tore apart the political order at home, but paradoxically, it also strengthened the imperial apparatus abroad. In the crucible of conflict, England learned to mobilize resources on an unprecedented scale, and under Cromwell's Commonwealth, it directed this new machinery toward maritime power and colonial expansion. The conflict between Crown and Parliament was in part a struggle over finance. Charles I's reliance on customs duties, monopolies, and forced loans angered merchants whose fortunes increasingly depended on overseas trade. Parliament, dominated by gentry with commercial interests, resisted taxation without consent. When war erupted in 1642, Both sides sought control of ports and fleets, for it was clear that mastery of the seas would be decisive. The parliamentarians, benefiting from London's wealth and shipyards, secured the navy. This proved crucial. With the Channel under its command, Parliament could blockade royalist ports, cut off supplies, and maintain overseas connections. It was the first demonstration that naval power, long seen as defensive, could also serve as a tool of internal political victory. The victory of Parliament did more than topple a king. It created a state apparatus capable of sustained fiscal extraction. The Commonwealth introduced regular taxation, excise duties, and most importantly, a professional standing army and navy. Oliver Cromwell's genius lay not only on the battlefield, but in recognizing that England's destiny depended on controlling commerce. In 1651, the Navigation Act was passed, a landmark in imperial policy. It decreed that goods imported into England or its colonies must be carried on English ships or those of the producing country. The target was clear: the Dutch. The United Provinces possessed the largest merchant marine in Europe, dominating the carrying trade between Baltic grain, Levantine spices, and Atlantic sugar. By excluding Dutch middlemen, England sought to reserve the profits of empire for itself. This legislation provoked war. The First Anglo-Dutch War, 1652 to 1654, was fought entirely at sea, a contest of fleets for control of trade routes. The English navy, now enlarged and reorganized, engaged the Dutch in a series of bloody battles: Dungeness 1652, Portland 1653, and Scheveningen 1653. Though losses were heavy on both sides, the English ultimately secured advantage, forcing the Dutch to accept the Navigation Act. The war revealed that England had graduated from opportunistic piracy to systemic naval warfare, a transformation made possible by the fiscal military state born of civil war. While fleets clashed in the Channel and North Sea, the Atlantic colonies were drawn deeper into the conflict. Some, like Virginia and Barbados, declared loyalty to the king, resisting Parliament's authority. The Commonwealth responded with naval expeditions, compelling their submission by 1652. This assertion of central authority ensured that the colonies would no longer act as semi-independent ventures, but as integral components of an imperial system. Their tobacco and sugar would flow to England, and in return, they would receive protection and markets. Thus the Civil War, though destructive at home, paradoxically bound the empire together. Cromwell's ambitions extended beyond the Atlantic. In 1655, he launched the Western Design, an expedition against Spain's Caribbean possessions. Jamaica was seized, though not without difficulty. The island would become one of the empire's most profitable colonies, its fertile soil ideal for sugar cultivation. Here the transformation was stark. Whereas Virginia's economy relied heavily on indentured English labor, Jamaica rapidly shifted to African slavery. The brutality of the plantation system cannot be overstated. Enslaved Africans were imported in vast numbers, subjected to crushing labor and appalling mortality rates. By the late 17th century, Jamaica alone would receive tens of thousands annually, making it a cornerstone of the Atlantic slave economy. This integration of colonies, commerce, and coercion marked the true birth of England's Atlantic Empire. The triangular trade, English manufactured goods exchanged for African slaves, slaves sold in the Caribbean for sugar, sugar shipped to England for refinement and profit, became the engine of national wealth. Ports such as Bristol and Liverpool grew into major centers, their fortunes tied directly to the slave trade. The empire was no longer a series of scattered outposts. It was a system, bound by law, navy, and commerce. The economic implications were profound. Customs revenues from colonial goods funded the navy, which in turn protected those goods on their voyage. The fiscal military state created in civil war was thus sustained by empire. What had begun as a struggle over domestic taxation had evolved into a global apparatus of mercantile war. England, once a marginal player, now stood as the Dutch Republic's principal rival for maritime supremacy. Cromwell's death in 1658 and the restoration of the monarchy in 1660 might have threatened this system, but instead it endured. Charles II retained the Navigation Acts and expanded them, recognizing their value. The Royal African Company, chartered in 1660, institutionalized England's role in the slave trade. Colonies in the Caribbean expanded production, while in North America settlements multiplied. The empire's architecture had been laid during the Commonwealth, and the restored monarchy found it too profitable to dismantle. Thus, the English Civil War and Cromwell's rule stand as paradoxical moments. Domestically, they fractured the old political order, introducing republican government and later restoring monarchy under new terms. Internationally, they forged the essential structures of empire: a navy capable of fleet warfare, laws binding commerce to English ships, colonies compelled to obedience, and a trade system rooted in slavery. Out of civil conflict emerged imperial coherence. By the close of the 17th century, England was no longer an island state on the margins of Europe, but a maritime power with colonies across the Atlantic, plantations in the Caribbean, and factories in India. Yet these gains came at immense cost. In human lives on plantations, in the perpetual wars at sea, and in the political tensions between merchants, parliament, and crown. The empire's expansion had been secured, but it had also locked England into a cycle of naval rivalry and colonial exploitation. That cycle would define the next century, culminating in the Great Continental Wars of Succession, where Britain's global ambitions would be tested against Bourbon France and Habsburg Spain. The imperial system forged under Cromwell and retained by the Restoration monarchy did not remain confined to the Atlantic. From the late 17th century onward, England's destiny became increasingly bound to continental wars. These conflicts were not distractions from overseas expansion. They were the crucible through which Britain would acquire strategic bases, commercial privileges, and the habit of global war. The Navigation Acts had bound colonial trade to English ships, but it was military victories on European battlefields and naval stations abroad that transformed England from a rising power into an empire of global reach. The restoration of Charles II in 1660 did not undo the mercantile edifice created under the Commonwealth. On the contrary, the Crown quickly realized the profits to be made from colonial commerce. The Royal African Company was granted a monopoly on the slave trade, linking the monarchy directly to the brutal triangular system that underpinned Caribbean sugar wealth. At the same time, the Navy was enlarged, its ships standardized and increasingly built at royal dockyards rather than private yards. This was not mere domestic consolidation. England was positioning itself for the century of warfare that lay ahead. The first great clash came with the Dutch, whose maritime supremacy still overshadowed England's. The Second Anglo-Dutch War, 1665 to 1667, was fought largely over commercial rivalries in the Atlantic and Asia. English fleets captured New Amsterdam in 1664, renaming it New York, while the Dutch in turn struck devastating blows at sea, culminating in their daring raid on the Medway in 1667, when they sailed up the Thames and burned English ships at anchor. The war ended indecisively, but the seizure of New Netherland permanently altered the balance of power in North America. The Dutch foothold on the Hudson River was transformed into an English colony, knitting together the chain of settlements from New England to Virginia. Conflict flared again in the 1670s. The Third Anglo-Dutch War, 1672 to 1674, fought within the wider Franco-Dutch War, saw England allied with Louis XIV of France. But the alliance proved fragile. Parliament and merchants alike feared French hegemony more than Dutch rivalry, and the war was abandoned, leaving the Dutch battered but still afloat. These contests revealed a fundamental truth. England's empire could not grow without constant recourse to arms, and those arms would increasingly be deployed not only in European waters, but in theaters stretching from the Caribbean to the Indian Ocean. It was in the final decades of the 17th century, however, that the stakes truly escalated. The rise of Louis XIV's France threatened the entire balance of European power. With vast armies, rich tax revenues, and ambitions that extended to the Rhine and the Spanish Netherlands, France appeared poised to dominate the continent. England, still adjusting to the constitutional settlement of the Glorious Revolution, 1688, found itself drawn into coalition warfare. William III, both King of England and Stadtholder of the Netherlands, anchored a grand alliance against Louis. The 9 Years' War, 1688 to 1697, stretched across Europe and into the colonies, where it was known in America as King William's War. English settlers clashed with French and their native allies in New England and Canada, while fleets fought in the Atlantic. Though inconclusive, the war entrenched England's commitment to balancing European power, a commitment that would yield profound imperial dividends. The true turning point came with the War of the Spanish Succession, 1701 to 1714. The death of Charles II of Spain without an heir opened a contest for Europe's greatest inheritance. The sprawling Spanish Empire, with its dominions in Italy, the Low Countries, and the Americas. Louis XIV sought to place his grandson, Philip of Anjou, on the throne, threatening to unite French and Spanish power. England, under the leadership of the formidable Duke of Marlborough and guided by the political direction of the Whigs, entered the war as part of the Grand Alliance alongside the Dutch and the Austrian Habsburgs. Marlborough's campaigns remain among the most celebrated in British military history. At Blenheim, 1704, he shattered French and Bavarian armies on the Danube, saving Vienna from capture. Ramillies, 1706, Oudenarde, 1708, and Malplaquet, 1709 followed, victories that secured the Low Countries and checked French dominance. These were not merely continental triumphs. They demonstrated that England could deploy and sustain armies abroad, financed by a sophisticated system of public credit created after the Glorious Revolution. The Bank of England, founded in 1694, allowed the government to borrow on a scale previously impossible, marrying financial innovation to military ambition. This fiscal military state gave Britain the endurance to outlast rivals in long wars. Naval power, however, remained the decisive imperial tool. The capture of Gibraltar in 1704 by an Anglo-Dutch fleet gave Britain a permanent fortress at the entrance to the Mediterranean. Though small in itself, the rock became one of the empire's most strategic possessions, controlling access to the inland sea. At the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, which concluded the war, Britain not only retained Gibraltar but gained Minorca as another Mediterranean base. More importantly, it secured the asiento, the right to supply African slaves to Spanish America for 30 years. This contract, deeply lucrative, placed Britain inside the Spanish colonial system, siphoning profits from an empire it did not directly control. The Treaty of Utrecht marked a watershed. Britain emerged as the principal beneficiary of a war fought across Europe and the seas. It had checked French hegemony, acquired strategic naval outposts, and embedded itself in the Atlantic slave economy at a new level of depth. The Dutch, exhausted by decades of war, faded as the chief maritime rival, leaving Britain and France to contest the global stage. The pattern of 18th-century empire was now set. Continental wars would be fought not merely for dynastic claims, but for overseas markets, colonies, and trade routes. By 1714, the British Empire was still modest compared to what it would become, but the essential architecture was visible. North America stretched from New England to the Carolinas, with New York cementing English presence on the Hudson. The Caribbean colonies were expanding sugar production, fueled by African slavery. In India, the East India Company maintained trading posts, awaiting opportunities to expand as Mughal authority waned. Gibraltar and the Asiento gave Britain footholds that were both commercial and strategic. And behind it all stood a navy increasingly unrivaled, sustained by taxes, credit, and the profits of trade. The paradox of this moment was striking. Britain, a kingdom of limited manpower compared to France or Spain, had leveraged financial innovation, maritime skill, and selective conquest into disproportionate gains. Its empire was no longer the product of improvisation or fragile settlements, but of calculated statecraft. Yet this success carried within it new tensions. The Asiento tied Britain more tightly to the brutal machinery of slavery. The colonies of North America grew more populous and self-confident, increasingly conscious of their distance from London, and the rivalry with France, far from settled, entered a new phase. The War of the Spanish Succession had given Britain its first unmistakable taste of global empire. The 7 Years' War, half a century later, would show how far that ambition could extend. The Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 had elevated Britain into the ranks of the great powers, Yet the century that followed would reveal the fragility of those gains. The Asiento opened new streams of profit, but it also tied British commerce into the jealous rivalries of the Atlantic world. Gibraltar offered strategic leverage, yet it required constant defense against Spanish attempts to retake it. More fundamentally, Britain's empire remained uneven. Modest colonies on the Atlantic seaboard, lucrative but vulnerable sugar islands, scattered factories in India, and naval bases spread thin. For all its promise, Britain's position was contested by France and Spain at every turn. The decisive struggle that would transform this patchwork into a coherent global empire came not in the 1710s or 1720s, but in the mid-18th century, when a series of wars fused European conflict with colonial rivalry on an unprecedented scale. The first rehearsal was the War of the Austrian Succession, 1740 to 1748. Ostensibly a dynastic dispute over Maria Theresa's inheritance of the Habsburg throne, it quickly widened into another Anglo-French contest. In North America, it was known as King George's War, the third of the so-called French and Indian Wars. The British colonists captured Louisbourg in 1745, a key fortress guarding the entrance to the St. Lawrence River. Yet at the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle, 1748, Britain returned it to France in exchange for gains in the Low Countries, a decision that enraged New Englanders who had bled to take it. This episode revealed a recurring problem. Britain's European commitments often clashed with colonial ambitions. The frustration of Aix-la-Chapelle fed directly into the next, far larger conflict. By the 1750s, Anglo-French rivalry stretched across continents. From Ohio River valleys in North America, where land-hungry settlers pressed into territory claimed by France and its native allies, to the Deccan Plains of India, where the East India Company's merchants backed local rivals to the French Compagnie des Indes. The spark came in the American backcountry. In 1754, a young George Washington led a Virginian militia against a French detachment near Fort Duquesne, a skirmish that ignited open hostilities. Within 2 years, the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, had engulfed Europe, North America, the Caribbean, West Africa, and India. It was the first conflict fought on a global scale, and Britain was at its center. The architect of Britain's war effort was William Pitt the Elder. Elevated to power in 1757, Pitt grasped what earlier ministers had not: that Britain's strength lay less in continental armies than in its navy and global reach. He supported Frederick the Great of Prussia with subsidies and small contingents, keeping France bogged down in European battles, while directing Britain's main resources to the seas and colonies. It was a strategy of calculated focus. Let allies bleed on land, while Britain seized the world overseas. The results were dramatic. In North America, British arms turned the tide. General James Wolfe's campaign up the St. Lawrence culminated in the capture of Quebec in 1759, after a daring assault on the Heights of Abraham. The victory sealed the fate of New France. Though Wolfe himself was killed in battle, the conquest of Quebec meant that Canada would fall to Britain. In India, Robert Clive's victory at Plassey in 1757 proved equally decisive. Backed by East India Company troops and allied with discontented Indian elites, Clive defeated the Nawab of Bengal and his French supporters, securing control over the richest province of the subcontinent. The revenues of Bengal alone would fund company expansion for generations. Naval victories multiplied. At Lagos and Quiberon Bay in 1759, the Royal Navy smashed French fleets, preventing invasion and strangling France's overseas commerce. Caribbean expeditions captured Guadeloupe, Martinique, and Havana, though Havana was later returned in exchange for Florida. West Africa's slaving forts were seized, further tightening Britain's grip on the transatlantic trade. By the early 1760s, France's colonial empire lay in ruins, and Spain, which entered the war belatedly, fared little better. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 confirmed the scale of Britain's triumph. France ceded Canada and all its territories east of the Mississippi to Britain, retaining only a few Caribbean sugar islands and fishing rights off Newfoundland. Spain ceded Florida, but received Louisiana from France as compensation. In India, France's trading posts were returned but stripped of fortifications and military privileges, ensuring British supremacy. Britain now stood as the undisputed master of North America and the dominant European power in India. The empire had doubled in scope, encompassing vast new territories and securing the global trading routes that sustained them. This victory was not without cost. The war had been the most expensive in British history, financed by unprecedented levels of debt. National borrowing soared from £75 million in 1756 to £133 million by 1763. While Pitt's strategy had secured empire, it left the treasury heavily burdened. Maintaining garrisons in Canada, protecting the Caribbean islands, and expanding the East India Company's armies in India all demanded resources. The empire was larger, but it was also more expensive to defend. This tension, between acquisition and administration, conquest and consolidation, would haunt Britain in the decades ahead. Yet in 1763, few doubted the scale of the achievement. A small island kingdom, once on the margins of Europe, had defeated France, the continent's greatest military power, on a global stage. Canada, Bengal, the Caribbean, and West African forts were now linked to Britain by law, navy, and commerce. London emerged as the center of a world-spanning system, its merchants dominating Atlantic trade, its financiers underwriting imperial debt, its navy patrolling from the Channel to the Indian Ocean. For the first time in history, one power exercised effective influence across all inhabited continents. And yet, beneath the triumph, cracks were already forming. In North America, colonists who had fought alongside British troops now bristled at restrictions imposed from London. In India, the East India Company transformed from a trading corporation into a territorial ruler, but its corruption and exploitation sowed instability. The very victories of 1763 had planted the seeds of future revolt and overextension. Thus, the 7 Years' War was both the high point of Britain's ascent and the beginning of its next crisis. It marked the birth of the first global empire, but also the moment when the cost of that empire began to weigh heavily. In the next chapter, we see how this cost unfolded, in disputes over taxation, in rebellion across the Atlantic, and in the loss of Britain's oldest and most populous colonies, the 13 states that would become the United States of America. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 marked the zenith of Britain's global reach. Yet within 2 decades, the empire that had stretched triumphantly across continents would suffer its most humiliating defeat: the loss of the 13 colonies along the Atlantic seaboard of North America. The irony was sharp. The very war that had delivered Canada and Bengal into British hands had also sowed the conditions for colonial rebellion. The American Revolution was not an accident of Enlightenment ideals alone. It was the product of imperial overstretch, fiscal strain, and the contradictions of governing a settler society across an ocean. The problem began with debt. Financing the 7 Years' War had doubled Britain's national burden, leaving Parliament desperate for revenue. The empire's expansion demanded new garrisons in Canada and the Caribbean, naval patrols across the Atlantic, and a vastly enlarged bureaucracy. Ministers argued that the colonies, which had benefited most directly from the expulsion of France from North America, should contribute more to imperial defense. The logic was pragmatic: a share of costs for a share of security. But to the colonists, accustomed to relative autonomy, the sudden imposition of taxes from London appeared less like collective responsibility than arbitrary intrusion. The first flashpoint came with the Sugar Act of 1764 and the Stamp Act of 1765, which placed duties on paper, legal documents, and printed materials. For colonists, the issue was not merely the sums involved, which were modest, but the principle. They had long governed themselves through elected assemblies, raising their own taxes. No taxation without representation was more than a slogan. It articulated the colonists' belief that Parliament, where they had no seats, had no right to levy internal taxes upon them. The British government, in turn, insisted on the sovereignty of Parliament over the empire. The two positions were irreconcilable. Resistance escalated into organized protest. The Sons of Liberty mobilized boycotts, intimidated tax collectors, and turned Boston into a center of radical agitation. Parliament repealed the Stamp Act in 1766, but only while reasserting its full legislative authority over the colonies. The cycle repeated. New duties under the Townshend Acts in 1767 provoked boycotts, leading to further confrontation. In 1770, British troops opened fire on a Boston crowd, killing 5, the Boston Massacre. The incident was magnified in colonial propaganda as evidence of tyranny. By the early 1770s, suspicion of imperial designs ran deep. The crisis sharpened with the Tea Act of 1773. Designed to bail out the struggling East India Company by granting it the right to sell surplus tea directly to the colonies at reduced prices, the measure inadvertently inflamed opposition. Colonists saw it as a ploy to establish the principle of taxation by stealth. In December 1773, protesters disguised as Mohawk Indians boarded ships in Boston Harbor and dumped 342 chests of tea into the water. The Boston Tea Party. London's response was swift and severe. The Coercive Acts of 1774 closed the port of Boston, curtailed Massachusetts self-government, and permitted British troops to be quartered in private homes. What ministers called the Intolerable Acts convinced many colonists that Britain intended not partnership but subjugation. By 1775, the situation had slipped beyond repair. Militia skirmished with British regulars at Lexington and Concord in April, and by June the Continental Congress had appointed George Washington commander of a makeshift army. The empire had descended into civil war across the Atlantic. At first, many colonists hoped for redress of grievances rather than independence. But as fighting dragged on and London refused compromise, sentiment hardened. In July 1776, Thomas Jefferson drafted the Declaration of Independence, proclaiming the colonies free states. The rhetoric of natural rights cloaked what was, at heart, a geopolitical rupture. Britain had lost control of its largest and most populous colonies. The war itself tested the empire's capacity to project power. Britain deployed tens of thousands of troops, supported by the world's most formidable navy, and occupied key cities such as New York and Philadelphia. Yet the sheer scale of the territory, combined with local resistance, stretched its forces thin. For every garrisoned port, rebel militias dominated the countryside. Supply lines ran thousands of miles across the Atlantic, vulnerable to storms and privateers. Meanwhile, the colonies fought on familiar ground, supported by civilian populations, and sustained by the conviction that survival itself required victory. The decisive factor, however, was international. In 1778, France entered the war, eager to avenge its losses of 1763. French fleets challenged the Royal Navy, forcing Britain to disperse its forces across the globe. Spain and the Dutch soon followed, transforming a colonial rebellion into a world war. Britain suddenly found itself defending Gibraltar, the Caribbean, and India, even as it struggled to suppress rebellion in North America. The empire was stretched to breaking point. The turning point came at Yorktown in 1781. General Cornwallis, commanding British forces in Virginia, found himself trapped on a peninsula by combined Franco-American forces. The French fleet under Admiral de Grasse blockaded Chesapeake Bay, preventing relief. Surrounded and outnumbered, Cornwallis surrendered his army of over 7,000 men. The defeat broke Britain's will to continue large-scale operations. Though fighting dragged on in outlying theaters, negotiations opened in Paris. The Treaty of Paris in 1783 recognized the independence of the United States, ceding to it the territory east of the Mississippi and south of Canada. For Britain, the loss was immense. Nearly 2 million square kilometers of land, a settler population of 2.5 million, and the richest agricultural hinterlands in the empire. Yet the empire itself did not collapse. Canada remained loyal, the Caribbean colonies continued to pour sugar into British markets, and the East India Company tightened its hold over Bengal. The lesson drawn in London was sobering. Empire could not be sustained by direct taxation of settler colonies, but it could endure through maritime commerce and control of trade routes. Thus, paradoxically, the loss of the 13 colonies marked not the death of Britain's empire, but its transformation. Freed from the burden of governing fractious settlers, Britain turned its energies toward Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean. Naval supremacy remained intact, and the commercial network still flourished. The American Revolution exposed the limits of imperial control, but it also clarified the empire's essence. Not territorial conquest for its own sake, but maritime dominance and profitable trade. The next phase would see this lesson applied with ruthless effect, as Britain expanded deeper into India and, after the defeat of Napoleon, into a century of global supremacy. The loss of the 13 colonies in 1783 forced Britain to reconsider the nature of its empire. The Atlantic world, though still profitable through Caribbean sugar, no longer offered the same promise of expansion. Instead, imperial energy shifted eastward, toward India, where the East India Company, already entrenched, began to evolve from merchant corporation to sovereign power. This transformation was neither sudden nor accidental. It was the product of decades of warfare, opportunism, and administrative innovation, culminating in the company's domination of the subcontinent by the early 19th century. The foundation had been laid a generation earlier at Plassey in 1757, when Robert Clive's victory over the Nawab of Bengal, aided by treachery among local elites, secured the province for the East India Company. Bengal was not merely another trading post. It was the wealthiest region of India, its fertile alluvial plains producing immense revenues from agriculture and trade. With control over Bengal's treasury, the company possessed not only profit but power. It could raise armies, purchase influence, and dictate terms to rulers who had once dwarfed it in resources. This marked a turning point. The company ceased to be simply a commercial actor. It became a political sovereign. The expansion continued through the latter half of the 18th century. The decline of the Mughal Empire created a patchwork of regional states: Mysore, Hyderabad, the Marathas, Awadh, each vying for supremacy. The company exploited this fragmentation. Through treaties, subsidies, and wars, it inserted itself as arbiter of power. The Anglo-Mysore Wars, 1767 to 1799, epitomized the process. Hyder Ali and his son Tipu Sultan sought to resist British encroachment with modernized armies, employing European advisors and artillery. Yet despite fierce resistance, Mysore was gradually worn down. The final war ended in 1799 with Tipu's death at Seringapatam, opening southern India to company control. In the west and center, conflict with the Marathas produced a similar outcome. Once the greatest native power in India, the Maratha Confederacy fractured under internal rivalries and the pressures of sustained war with the company. Successive Anglo-Maratha Wars, 1775 to 1818, ended with British dominance, culminating in the defeat of the Peshwa in 1818. By then, the company controlled not only Bengal and the south, but also much of the Deccan and central India. What had begun as scattered coastal factories had become a territorial state spanning millions of square kilometers. The company's armies were at the heart of this transformation. By the late 18th century, the East India Company commanded forces larger than those of many European states. Its Bengal Army, Madras Army, and Bombay Army together numbered over 200,000 men, the vast majority Indian sepoys under British officers. Funded by local revenues, these armies allowed the company to wage continuous campaigns without draining the British treasury directly. They embodied the paradox of empire. Britain ruled India with Indian soldiers, paid for by Indian taxes, in the service of a private corporation. The profits extracted were immense, but they came at great human cost. Bengal, subjected to heavy taxation and the disruption of traditional agrarian systems, suffered devastating famines. The Great Bengal Famine of 1770 killed an estimated 10 million people, a catastrophe exacerbated by company revenue demands that continued even as crops failed. Such tragedies revealed the exploitative logic of company rule. Revenue extraction took precedence over subsistence, commerce over humanity. Yet in London, the dividends flowed and shareholders reaped fortunes. These abuses provoked criticism even in Britain. Edmund Burke, in his famous impeachment trial of Warren Hastings, the company's first governor-general, denounced what he called a species of despotism unknown to Europe. Parliament, alarmed by the scale of power wielded by a private corporation, began to impose oversight. The Regulating Act of 1773 established governmental supervision, while Pitt's India Act of 1784 created a board of control in London to direct policy. Though the company retained its structures, it was now effectively subordinated to the British state. The distinction between corporate empire and national empire blurred, foreshadowing the eventual absorption of India into the crown. Yet even under increased supervision, expansion accelerated. The company's administrators developed elaborate systems of revenue collection, codifying property rights, and imposing fixed settlements that reshaped Indian society. Landholders were made directly responsible for tax collection, while peasants were subjected to cash payments in a monetized economy. The consequences were profound. Traditional agrarian balances were disrupted, and the economy became ever more dependent on export crops and British markets. Cotton, indigo, and opium became staples of trade, linking Indian agriculture to global circuits of profit. The global implications were no less significant. Indian opium, exported by the company to China, became the linchpin of Britain's trade with Asia, compensating for the deficit created by imports of Chinese tea and porcelain. By the turn of the 19th century, Britain had embedded India not merely as a colony, but as the economic engine of its Asian commerce. The revenues of Bengal funded the Royal Navy's operations. The armies of sepoys extended British influence into Afghanistan and Burma, and Indian goods filled the warehouses of London and Liverpool. The empire had shifted east, and its new foundations were being laid on the banks of the Ganges rather than the Hudson. For contemporaries, the contrast with America was striking. In the West, Britain had lost colonies of settlers who demanded rights and representation. In the East, it had gained dominion over millions who were subjects without citizenship. The American Revolution had shown the dangers of trying to tax Englishmen abroad. India offered the alternative of ruling through subjugation and distance. It was empire not of kinship but of command. By the early 19th century, the East India Company controlled much of the subcontinent. Its authority was still exercised in the name of the Mughal emperor, a shadowy figure confined to Delhi, but in practice the company governed directly or through puppet rulers. The fiction of native sovereignty concealed a new reality. India had become the pivot of the British Empire. Its armies projected power across Asia, its revenues sustained Britain's wars, and its markets integrated Britain into global commerce. What had begun as a joint stock experiment in 1600 had by 1800 become the core of a global empire. Yet this triumph was fragile. The very methods of rule, revenue extraction, military reliance on sepoys, and disregard for local customs, bred resentment. Beneath the surface of apparent stability lay tensions that would one day explode in rebellion. For the moment, however, Britain's empire stood transformed. From the ashes of America, a new imperial system had arisen in India, larger in scale, richer in resources, and more central to Britain's global supremacy. The stage was set for the next chapter, the Napoleonic Wars, when Britain's naval dominance and India's revenues would combine to create an era later remembered as Pax Britannica. By the final decades of the 18th century, Britain's empire had been reshaped. America was lost, but India was consolidated, and the Caribbean remained a profitable cornerstone. More crucially, the empire was now integrated into a global commercial system, underwritten by a navy unrivaled in reach. It was precisely at this moment of transformation that Europe descended into its most prolonged and destructive conflict since the 30 Years' War. The French Revolution of 1789 and the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte not only reordered continental politics, but also tested Britain's imperial system to its limits. The wars that followed, stretching from 1793 to 1815, revealed the full measure of Britain's strengths: finance, naval mastery, and the capacity to harness imperial revenues. Out of them emerged the long century of Pax Britannica. When revolutionary France declared war on Britain in 1793, the kingdom faced a formidable adversary. France commanded Europe's largest population, fielded mass armies under the levy en masse, and possessed ambitions that extended from the Low Countries to Italy. On land, Britain could not match these forces. Its standing army numbered scarcely 40,000 at the war's outset, dwarfed by French levies of hundreds of thousands. But Britain possessed what the Revolution had shattered in France: credit. The financial system constructed after 1688, with the Bank of England at its core, allowed Britain to borrow on a scale no other power could match. Between 1793 and 1815, the British government raised over £1.6 billion. 10 times the sum of its annual revenues. These loans financed subsidies to continental allies, keeping Austria, Prussia, and Russia in the field against Napoleon, even when they suffered repeated defeats. The second pillar was the Royal Navy. From the outset of war, Britain imposed blockades, patrolled the Channel, and sought to strangle French commerce. Victories were decisive. At Cape St. Vincent in 1797, Admiral Jervis defeated a larger Spanish fleet, securing Britain's dominance in the western Mediterranean. But the most famous triumph came at Trafalgar in 1805. Admiral Horatio Nelson, commanding 27 ships against 33 Franco-Spanish vessels, broke the enemy line and annihilated their fleet off the coast of Spain. Nelson himself was killed in the battle, but his victory ensured that Napoleon could never invade Britain. From that moment, the seas belonged to Britain, and naval supremacy became the empire's most enduring weapon. This supremacy had direct imperial consequences. In the Caribbean, British expeditions seized colonies from France and its allies, capturing Trinidad, 1797, St. Lucia, 1803, and briefly occupying other islands. In South Africa, the Cape Colony was taken from the Dutch in 1795 and again in 1806, securing Britain a crucial way station on the route to India. In Asia, the East India Company exploited the wars to expand its territorial reach, defeating Tipu Sultan of Mysore in 1799 and consolidating control over southern India. By 1803, Delhi itself had fallen under company influence, and the Marathas were brought to heel. Thus, while Britain fought for survival in Europe, it was simultaneously expanding its empire overseas. Napoleon, recognizing his inability to invade Britain, sought instead to undermine its trade through the continental system. In 1806, he decreed that European ports under French control would be closed to British goods. In theory, this would cripple Britain's economy by cutting off continental markets. In practice, it failed. Britain's navy ensured that smuggling continued, while markets in Asia and the Americas absorbed much of the displaced trade. Moreover, the very enforcement of the blockade drew Napoleon into overextension, dragging him into Spain and eventually into the disastrous invasion of Russia in 1812. Britain, by contrast, continued to finance its allies and sustain its war effort through customs duties, excise taxes, and loans underwritten by the confidence of its creditors. The final campaigns from 1812 to 1815 confirmed the pattern. British forces under Wellington fought in the Iberian Peninsula, gradually wearing down French armies through a grinding war of attrition. Funded by subsidies and supplied through naval dominance, Wellington's army crossed into France itself by 1814. After Napoleon's temporary abdication and return during the Hundred Days, it was again British arms, this time in alliance with the Prussians under Blücher, that delivered the decisive blow at Waterloo in June 1815. The victory ended 2 decades of war and cemented Britain's role as arbiter of European balance. The peace that followed created an international order uniquely favorable to Britain. At the Congress of Vienna, 1814 to 1815, the Continental powers focused on restoring dynasties and drawing borders in Europe. Britain, by contrast, emerged with its empire enlarged. It retained the Cape Colony, Ceylon, Trinidad, and Mauritius, strategic points controlling sea lanes from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean. The French and Dutch colonial empires were diminished, and Spain's American colonies soon embarked on independence struggles, leaving Britain in prime position to dominate trade. No rival could match its navy, its credit, or its network of bases. This dominance inaugurated what historians later called Pax Britannica, the century-long period in which Britain's naval supremacy and financial weight maintained a relative peace among great powers. It was not an age without war. Britain fought in Burma, China, Afghanistan, and the Crimea. But it was an age in which no single state could challenge its global position. The Industrial Revolution, gathering pace in the early 19th century, multiplied this advantage, making Britain the workshop of the world, producing textiles, iron, and machinery that flooded international markets. The empire, no longer centered on colonies of settlement as in America, was now a network of ports, plantations, and markets, integrated by steam and sail, enforced by gunboats, and financed by London's capital. The transformation was immense. In 1783, the empire had seemed wounded by the loss of America. By 1815, it was stronger than ever, stretching across Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean, underpinned by a navy that commanded the seas and an economy that churned with industrial power. The wars that had threatened Britain's very survival had instead accelerated its rise. From Trafalgar to Waterloo, Britain had outlasted Napoleon by wielding the tools of maritime supremacy, financial credit, and imperial revenues. What emerged was not merely a victorious kingdom, but a global hegemon. Yet this new order carried contradictions. The Industrial Revolution created unprecedented wealth, but it also demanded raw materials and new markets, drawing Britain into deeper entanglements abroad. Naval supremacy kept the seas open, but it also bred complacency, encouraging reliance on trade rather than territorial integration. Above all, the empire's prosperity depended increasingly on India, where company rule was both lucrative and brittle. The Pax Britannica rested on power, but also on pressures that would, in time, strain the system. For the moment, however, Britain stood at the summit, its flag planted on every ocean, its fleets unchallenged, its empire unrivaled. The defeat of Napoleon in 1815 left Britain with no rival of equal strength. Its navy ruled the seas, its finances underwrote European stability, and its empire sprawled across continents. Yet hegemony was not static. The first half of the 19th century witnessed a profound shift in Britain's imperial methods. Where once territorial conquest had dominated, now commercial penetration, naval enforcement, and selective annexations defined strategy. It was an age of informal empire, where Britain imposed its will not always through colonies, but through markets, treaties, and naval coercion. Yet in key regions, Africa, India, and East Asia, informal empire shaded into formal control. The contradictions of humanitarian rhetoric, mercantile greed, and industrial necessity gave Britain both unprecedented reach and enduring vulnerability. One arena of change was the Atlantic. In 1807, Britain abolished the transatlantic slave trade, the first major power to do so. This decision was not simply moral but strategic. Industrial Britain required free labor markets and access to commodities rather than reliance on slaving monopolies. Yet abolition was enforced with real vigor. The Royal Navy's West Africa Squadron patrolled the coasts, intercepting slave ships and liberating captives, landing tens of thousands in Sierra Leone. Between 1808 and 1860, nearly 1,600 slave vessels were seized. Britain cast itself as the moral arbiter of the seas, contrasting its civilizing mission with the continued slaving of Brazil, Cuba, and the United States. But beneath this humanitarian posture lay hard calculation. Naval supremacy gave Britain leverage over weaker states, while suppression of rivals slaving opened new opportunities for legitimate trade in palm oil, ivory, and other African exports. West Africa thus became a laboratory of informal empire. British merchants established coastal footholds, trading for commodities vital to industry. Missionaries and consuls accompanied them, pressing for treaties that restricted slavery and opened commerce. Yet inland penetration was limited, and African states retained autonomy. Britain preferred influence without responsibility, trade without costly conquest. It would not be until the later 19th century's scramble for Africa that this pattern shifted into wholesale colonization. Still, the moral and commercial frameworks laid down after 1807 framed Britain's self-image as both humanitarian power and global enforcer. If Africa represented the projection of naval policing, Asia revealed the full weight of mercantile coercion. China, with its immense markets for tea and silk, was a prize beyond measure. But Britain's appetite for Chinese goods outstripped Chinese demand for British manufactures, creating a persistent trade deficit. The solution lay in India. From Bengal's fields, the East India Company produced opium, exporting it illegally into China despite imperial prohibitions. By the 1830s, millions of Chinese were addicted, and silver flowed back into British coffers. It was a commerce both lucrative and destabilizing, and when the Qing dynasty sought to suppress it, conflict erupted. The First Opium War, 1839 to 1842, was a textbook display of Britain's new imperial strategy. A limited war, fought thousands of miles from London, was waged by a small expeditionary force supported by naval supremacy. British warships bombarded coastal defenses, seized Canton, and sailed up the Yangtze to threaten Nanking. The Qing, militarily outmatched, sued for peace. The Treaty of Nanking, 1842, opened 5 treaty ports to British trade, ceded Hong Kong as a crown colony, and established the principle of most favored nation status. For the first time, China's sovereignty was breached by foreign power. A second conflict, the Arrow War, 1856 to 1860, deepened the intrusion, opening more ports and granting extraterritorial rights to British subjects. Thus, through limited force and maritime supremacy, Britain pried open one of the world's oldest empires for commerce, embedding itself not through annexation but through treaties backed by gunboats. India, meanwhile, remained the empire's pivot. After the defeat of the Marathas in 1818, company rule encompassed most of the subcontinent. But expansion did not cease. Campaigns extended into Burma in the 1820s and 1850s, seizing territory and securing trade routes into Southeast Asia. In the northwest, pressure from Russian advances into Central Asia spurred British interventions in Afghanistan, leading to the ill-fated First Anglo-Afghan War, 1839 to 1842. Though a military disaster, it revealed the strategic anxieties of empire. India had become the jewel, and any threat to its frontiers provoked intervention, however costly. The revenues of India, its cotton and opium, its armies of sepoys, sustained Britain's imperial system. Protecting it became the cornerstone of policy. The same logic drove expansion in southern Africa. The Cape Colony, taken from the Dutch during the Napoleonic Wars, was retained not for its wealth, but for its strategic location, commanding the route to India. British settlers clashed with the indigenous Xhosa peoples, sparking frontier wars, while Boer farmers trekked northward to escape British rule, laying foundations for future conflict. Here again, Britain pursued strategic footholds rather than wholesale colonization, bases and corridors essential to imperial communications. This mid-century moment was one of paradox. On the one hand, Britain prided itself on being the liberator of the seas, suppressing slavery, promoting free trade, and advancing the rhetoric of civilization. On the other, it enforced commerce at gunpoint in China, extracted revenues mercilessly from India, and expanded territorial control where strategic necessity demanded. The empire was both liberal and coercive, humanitarian and exploitative. Its coherence lay not in ideology but in method. Control of trade routes, selective annexation of key nodes, and reliance on naval supremacy to enforce a global system. By the 1850s, the outlines of Britain's mid-19th century empire were clear. India was administered by the East India Company, but increasingly supervised by Parliament, producing revenues and goods that underpinned imperial trade. China was penetrated by treaty ports, a fragile foothold maintained by force. West Africa was shaped by anti-slavery patrols and commercial treaties. Southern Africa was a settler frontier under contest. The Caribbean, though still profitable, had begun to decline with the abolition of slavery in 1833. The empire was not static. It was a constantly shifting network, responding to industrial demand, strategic fear, and global rivalry. The Pax Britannica of the early 19th century, therefore, was not peace in any absolute sense. It was a peace for Britain, secured by the absence of rivals at sea, but underwritten by constant limited wars, expeditions, and coercion abroad. The contradictions of this system, humanitarian rhetoric masking coercive practice, informal influence sliding into formal annexation, would sharpen in the next decades. The greatest test would come in 1857, when India, the very jewel of the empire, erupted in violent rebellion, forcing Britain to reconsider not only its methods, but the very legitimacy of its imperial rule. By the mid-19th century, India was not simply Britain's richest possession. It was the keystone of the entire imperial arch. Its revenues financed Britain's army of sepoys, its cotton and opium sustained global trade, and its ports connected Britain to Asia and beyond. Yet the very system that made India so vital was riddled with contradictions. The East India Company, a private corporation acting as sovereign, ruled through a patchwork of treaties, direct annexations, and fiscal exactions. Its administrators spoke the language of progress, law, and order, but the realities of revenue collection, cultural insensitivity, and military coercion bred resentment across the subcontinent. The tension reached breaking point in 1857, when what began as a mutiny among sepoy regiments in northern India escalated into the most serious crisis in the history of Britain's empire. The causes of the rebellion were layered. Economically, the company's land policies strained traditional systems. In Bengal, the permanent settlement of 1793 had fixed land revenues, but empowered zamindars as tax collectors, squeezing peasants. Elsewhere, the company imposed high assessments, demanding cash payments even in times of scarcity. Peasant indebtedness grew, and famines became recurrent. The annexation of territories under the doctrine of lapse, by which the company claimed lands from Indian rulers who died without direct heirs, alienated local elites. In 1856, the annexation of Oudh, a wealthy kingdom with deep aristocratic traditions, symbolized the arrogance of company rule. Nobles, soldiers, and peasants alike saw their world overturned. Cultural grievances deepened the alienation. Christian missionaries, though never numerous, were associated with the company, fueling fears of religious interference. Reforms such as banning sati, the practice of widow immolation, or promoting Western education were hailed in Britain as humanitarian progress, but perceived by many Indians as assaults on custom. Above all, the sepoys, Indian soldiers who formed the backbone of the company's army, felt their traditions violated. Paid modestly, deployed far from home, and commanded by British officers, they endured daily slights to dignity. When rumors spread in 1857 that new Enfield rifle cartridges were greased with cow and pig fat, offensive alike to Hindu and Muslim soldiers, who would have to bite them open, outrage ignited. Whether the rumor was true mattered less than the symbolism. The company had crossed a sacred line. The spark came at Meerut in May 1857. Sepoys who refused the cartridges were imprisoned. Comrades mutinied, killed their officers, and marched on Delhi. There they declared allegiance to the aging Mughal Emperor Bahadur Shah II, transforming a mutiny into a revolt. The city became the symbolic center of resistance, and soon uprisings spread across northern and central India. In Kanpur, Lucknow, Jhansi, and beyond, civilians joined soldiers, grievances merged, and company rule seemed suddenly fragile. The violence was intense. In Kanpur, British civilians were massacred after surrendering, a horror magnified in Britain as proof of native barbarity. In Delhi, rebels killed Europeans and proclaimed the restoration of Mughal sovereignty. But repression was equally ferocious. British reprisals, once the tide turned, were marked by hangings, executions by cannon fire, and the wholesale destruction of villages. The conflict was not a uniform national uprising. Many regions, such as Punjab in the south, remained loyal or neutral, but in the Ganges heartland it reached the scale of a civil war. The siege of Lucknow epitomized the struggle. British defenders, besieged for months, held out under appalling conditions until relief forces broke through. In Jhansi, Rani Lakshmibai led armed resistance with remarkable courage, becoming a symbol of defiance. Yet by 1858, the company's superior resources, the loyalty of Sikh and Gurkha troops, and reinforcements from Britain crushed the rebellion. Delhi fell in September 1857. The Mughal emperor was captured and exiled, and by mid-1858 organized resistance had collapsed. The consequences were profound. In Britain, the shock was immense. The rebellion was portrayed not as a political revolt, but as a betrayal, a mutiny by soldiers who had enjoyed British pay. The massacre of civilians in Kanpur was seared into public memory, fueling calls for retribution. Yet sober voices in Parliament recognized that company rule had failed. A private corporation, however wealthy, could not govern a subcontinent of 200 million people with legitimacy or stability. Reform was unavoidable. In 1858, the East India Company was formally dissolved, and India was placed under the direct authority of the British Crown. The Government of India Act transferred sovereignty to a new office of Secretary of State for India, assisted by a council in London. A viceroy, representing the monarch, replaced the Governor-General in Calcutta. Symbolically, Queen Victoria issued a proclamation promising to respect Indian religions, protect property rights, and involve Indians in governance. Whether or not these promises were honored, the message was clear. India was no longer the fief of merchants, but the crown jewel of Britain's imperial system. The reorganization extended to the military. The sepoy armies were restructured to prevent unified rebellion. Artillery was reserved for Europeans, recruitment was diversified by region and caste, and loyalty was cultivated among Sikhs, Gurkhas, and Pathans. The lesson was that India must be ruled by divide and discipline, balancing native groups against one another under British command. The administrative service was professionalized with an elite cadre of civil servants, later known as the steel frame of the Raj, trained to govern districts, collect revenues, and enforce law. The rebellion of 1857 thus marked a watershed. It ended the era of company sovereignty, destroyed the last vestiges of Mughal legitimacy, and inaugurated direct crown rule. It also reshaped imperial ideology. Where earlier administrators had spoken of progress and reform, now caution prevailed. Britain sought to present itself as protector of Indian traditions, ruling through princes and landlords rather than overturning them. Yet this conservatism was accompanied by a deepening racial divide. The memory of rebellion hardened British attitudes, entrenching notions of superiority and mistrust that would define the Raj. For the empire as a whole, the lesson was sobering. The British had learned in America that settler colonies could not be taxed into submission. In India, they learned that direct interference with culture and property risked rebellion. The solution was paternalism backed by overwhelming force, a rhetoric of guardianship masking the reality of control. India would remain the jewel in the crown, but its governance would henceforth be more cautious, more centralized, and more explicitly imperial. Thus, from the fires of 1857 emerged the British Raj, an empire within an empire, vast in scale, rich in resources, and indispensable to Britain's global supremacy. Yet the violence of its birth revealed the fragility beneath the facade. The rebellion had shown that beneath the machinery of company and crown lay a society restless under foreign rule, capable of explosive resistance. Britain had quelled the flames, but the embers of resentment would smolder, shaping the future of both India and the empire itself. The transfer of India from company to crown in 1858 gave the British Empire a new administrative solidity, but it did not end the appetite for expansion. By the second half of the 19th century, Britain found itself both driven and compelled to extend its reach. Industrial capitalism demanded raw materials, markets, and secure trade routes. Strategic anxieties, particularly regarding France, Germany, and later Russia, forced Britain to seize territory it might otherwise have left untouched. And a new ideology of civilization and progress clothed these pursuits in moral justification. Nowhere did these dynamics converge more dramatically than in Africa, where the decades between the 1870s and 1900 witnessed one of the most rapid partitions of a continent in human history. Britain's initial footholds in Africa were modest and pragmatic. The Cape Colony, held since the Napoleonic Wars, functioned primarily as a naval station on the route to India. Sierra Leone, established in the late 18th century as a settlement for freed slaves, became the headquarters of the Royal Navy's West Africa Squadron. Along the coast, Britain maintained forts and trading posts for palm oil, ivory, and other commodities. Inland penetration was limited, expensive, and often resisted by African polities. For much of the early century, Britain preferred informal empire, trade, treaties, and influence to costly conquest. The shift came after mid-century. The opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 revolutionized imperial logistics, making the route from Britain to India and East Asia far shorter, but also far more vulnerable. Control of Egypt became imperative. In 1882, after nationalist uprisings threatened the security of the canal, British forces occupied Egypt. Though formally the country remained under Ottoman suzerainty, in practice it became a British protectorate, administered through advisors in Cairo and defended by garrisons along the Nile. The occupation was justified in London as temporary, but it lasted until the mid-20th century. Suez symbolized the new logic. Strategic chokepoints would not be left in uncertain hands. This seizure coincided with a wider European rush into Africa. The Berlin Conference of 1884–85, convened by Chancellor Bismarck of Germany, formalized the scramble. European powers, Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, Portugal, and Italy, agreed on rules for partition, requiring effective occupation to legitimize claims. The map of Africa, once dominated by indigenous kingdoms and stateless societies, was rapidly carved into European colonies. For Britain, the stakes were immense: to control the Nile, to secure southern Africa's resources, and to link Cairo to the Cape in an unbroken chain of dominion. In the Sudan, resistance was fierce. The rise of the Mahdist state in the 1880s challenged Egyptian and British control. The siege of Khartoum in 1884–85 ended in disaster, with General Charles Gordon killed as Mahdist forces overran the city. For nearly 15 years, the British avoided reoccupation, wary of cost and overextension. Yet the strategic logic of the Nile could not be ignored. In 1898, General Kitchener led a massive expedition up the river, culminating in the Battle of Omdurman. Modern rifles, artillery, and Maxim guns slaughtered Mahdist forces. Over 10,000 killed in a single day, demonstrating the brutal asymmetry of industrial warfare. Sudan was annexed in the aftermath. Its administration shared nominally with Egypt, but in practice controlled from London. Southern Africa presented a different but equally intense arena. The discovery of diamonds in Kimberley in 1867 and gold in the Transvaal in 1886 transformed the region's significance. Boer republics, established by Dutch-descended settlers after the Great Trek, resisted British encroachment, clinging to independence in the Orange Free State and South African Republic. Cecil Rhodes and other imperialists envisioned a British-controlled axis from Cape to Cairo, and southern Africa was central to that vision. Tensions over resources, sovereignty, and race erupted in the Anglo-Boer Wars. The First Boer War, 1880–81, ended with a humiliating British defeat at Majuba Hill, but the Second Boer War, 1899–1902, was fought with overwhelming force. After bitter guerrilla resistance, scorched earth tactics, and the notorious use of concentration camps, Britain triumphed. The Boer republics were absorbed, paving the way for the Union of South Africa in 1910, a dominion under British control but dominated by white settler politics. Elsewhere, British expansion was rapid and opportunistic. In West Africa, protectorates were proclaimed over the Gold Coast, modern Ghana, Nigeria, and Sierra Leone, integrating regions long associated with trade into formal colonies. In East Africa, Britain competed with Germany, establishing control over Kenya and Uganda, projecting power along the Indian Ocean coast. From the Niger to Lake Victoria, treaties, military expeditions, and railways bound vast territories into the imperial framework. This expansion was driven by multiple forces. Industrialists sought markets for textiles and machinery. Financiers looked to secure returns from mines and railways, and missionaries pressed for Christianization and education. Politicians, anxious about German and French competition, embraced annexation to maintain Britain's global supremacy. Public opinion, shaped by newspapers and imperial exhibitions, increasingly saw empire as a source of pride, a symbol of national greatness in an age of mass politics. Yet the costs were high. Conquest often entailed massacres, forced labor, and the destruction of African polities. The Zulu Kingdom, the Asante Empire, the Mahdist of Sudan, and countless smaller states were defeated and dismantled. Railways and telegraphs imposed new economic orders, subordinating African production to imperial markets. While Britain celebrated the civilizing mission, the realities were coercive. Taxation enforced by Hut and Pole levies, land expropriation for settlers, and exploitation of mineral wealth by chartered companies. By 1900, the British Empire in Africa stretched from Cairo to Cape Town, from Lagos to Zanzibar. It encompassed Egypt, Sudan, Nigeria, the Gold Coast, Sierra Leone, Kenya, Uganda, Rhodesia, Bechuanaland, and South Africa. The dream of a Cape to Cairo railway, though never fully realized, symbolized the ambition. Africa, once peripheral, had become a central arena of imperial rivalry, its resources feeding Britain's industries, its strategic corridors securing routes to India and the East. The scramble for Africa thus marked the last great territorial expansion of the British Empire. It created vast new colonies, but also new challenges, governing diverse populations, justifying imperial rule, and confronting the violence inherent in conquest. For Britain, the late 19th century seemed an era of triumph, its empire larger than ever before, its global supremacy unchallenged. Yet beneath the surface, strains accumulated. Nationalism in colonies, competition with Germany, and the costs of defending an empire so vast would soon reveal themselves. The zenith of territorial control carried within it the seeds of future crisis. By the dawn of the 20th century, the British Empire was at the height of its territorial expansion. The scramble for Africa had been concluded with Britain holding a lion's share of the continent, while India remained the empire's indispensable core. The Caribbean, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand provided settler dominions bound by allegiance to the crown. Strategic possessions stretched in a global arc: Gibraltar, Malta, Suez, Aden, Singapore, Hong Kong, and the Cape, securing sea routes along which the Royal Navy moved with unrivaled confidence. At its zenith, the empire encompassed nearly a quarter of the Earth's land surface and population. To contemporaries, it appeared that Britain had achieved a permanence beyond question, a world order fixed beneath the Union Jack. Yet behind this outward strength, currents of change ran deep. The Second Boer War, 1899–1902, revealed both the resilience and the vulnerability of empire. Britain triumphed over the Boer republics, securing the gold and diamond fields of the Transvaal, but at a heavy cost. The war required the mobilization of 450,000 imperial troops, lasted far longer than expected, and exposed weaknesses in recruitment, logistics, and military preparedness. Reports of concentration camps, where tens of thousands of Boer civilians perished from disease, tarnished Britain's moral authority abroad. The conflict was a victory, but not the effortless demonstration of supremacy that imperial enthusiasts had hoped for. Nevertheless, the aftermath of the Boer War also illustrated the adaptive capacity of Britain's imperial system. In 1910, the Union of South Africa was created, granting self-government to the white settler population and integrating the former Boer republics into the empire as a dominion. It followed the model already established in Canada, 1867, Australia, 1901, and New Zealand, 1907, where settler colonies were bound to Britain not by direct administration, but by shared institutions, trade, and allegiance to the monarchy. These dominions represented a new form of empire, politically autonomous in domestic affairs, yet united by culture, language, and imperial defense. They were not colonies to be held down, but partners in what some imagined as an imperial federation. In this sense, the Edwardian years were the apogee not only of territorial possession, but of a reimagined imperial unity. Economically, Britain remained the world's workshop, though the first signs of industrial rivalry were apparent. Coal, steel, and textiles still poured from British factories, financed by capital from London, the hub of global finance. But Germany and the United States were growing rapidly, challenging Britain's lead in new industries such as chemicals, electricity, and engineering. The empire provided both resources and markets, yet the balance of power in the global economy was subtly shifting. Still, in 1913, Britain accounted for more than 40% of the world's overseas investments. Railways in India, mines in Africa, and plantations in Malaya were built with British capital, binding the world to the financial heart of London. Strategically, the Edwardian era was dominated by rivalry with Germany. The Kaiser's decision to build a battle fleet under Admiral von Tirpitz threatened Britain's naval supremacy, which since Trafalgar had been unquestioned. In response, the Admiralty under Sir John Fisher initiated the construction of HMS Dreadnought in 1906, a revolutionary battleship that rendered existing fleets obsolete. An arms race ensued, with Britain determined to maintain the two-power standard, the ability to outmatch the next two largest navies combined. Naval bases at Gibraltar, Malta, and Scapa Flow were reinforced, and the Mediterranean fleet was redeployed as tensions with Germany grew. The empire's global defense system was reoriented toward the North Sea, a sign that imperial strength could not be divorced from European rivalry. Politically, the empire also became a subject of debate at home. Imperialists such as Joseph Chamberlain argued for tariff reform and an economic bloc binding the dominions and colonies to Britain, insulating the empire from global competition. Free traders resisted, fearing higher prices and loss of Britain's industrial dynamism. The result was stalemate. The empire remained commercially integrated, but not bound by formal tariff walls. The dominions enjoyed growing autonomy, while colonies in Africa and Asia were ruled more tightly, their economies directed toward imperial needs. Culturally, the Edwardian era was marked by confidence and spectacle. Imperial exhibitions in London and elsewhere showcased the empire's diversity, displaying peoples and products from every continent as proof of Britain's global mission. Kipling's verse extolled the white man's burden, and schoolchildren learned geography through maps shaded red. Yet alongside celebration came unease. Reports from India revealed growing nationalist sentiment, with the Indian National Congress demanding reform. In Egypt, agitation against British occupation simmered. In Ireland, demands for home rule threatened the cohesion of the United Kingdom itself. The empire appeared mighty, but dissent was never far from the surface. Militarily, Britain relied increasingly on imperial manpower. Indian soldiers garrisoned frontiers from Afghanistan to Burma, fought in campaigns in Sudan and South Africa, and stood ready as the empire's reserve. African troops were recruited for service in West Africa and the Nile Valley. The dominions developed their own forces, though still tied to imperial strategy. This global distribution of manpower allowed Britain to maintain a relatively small home army, confident that the empire itself was a reservoir of defense. Yet this reliance also bound Britain's security to the loyalty of its subjects, a loyalty that would be tested in the Great War to come. By 1914, the British Empire was larger than at any point in its history, covering nearly 30 million square kilometers and ruling over 400 million people. It appeared an empire without rival, commanding the seas, controlling strategic chokepoints, and binding continents through trade and finance. And yet, the very scale that made it formidable also made it fragile. Its cohesion rested on assumptions of naval superiority, settler loyalty, and colonial compliance. The rise of Germany, the stirrings of nationalism in Asia and Africa, and the tensions within the British Isles themselves hinted that this triumph was not eternal. The Edwardian zenith, then, was less a plateau than a summit before descent. The empire in 1914 was at once magnificent and precarious, a structure whose apparent solidity concealed cracks beneath the surface. When the First World War erupted, those cracks would widen into fissures, testing whether the empire's global supremacy could survive the strains of modern total war. The Edwardian Empire of 1914 stood at the height of its territorial reach, but the outbreak of war in August that year subjected its foundations to an unprecedented test. What began as a European crisis following the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand rapidly became a global war because Britain's empire stretched across continents. When Britain declared war on Germany on August 4th, the dominions, colonies, and protectorates were drawn in automatically. What followed was the most comprehensive mobilization of imperial resources in history. Yet it was also the beginning of a transformation. The war that demonstrated the empire's vast capacity also revealed the limits of its endurance. From the outset, Britain's entry into the war was framed by its strategic commitments. The German invasion of Belgium triggered treaty obligations and, more importantly, threatened control of the Channel coast opposite Britain's industrial heartland. Naval supremacy was preserved by the swift imposition of a blockade against Germany, choking imports of food and raw materials. The Grand Fleet, based at Scapa Flow, ensured that Germany's high seas fleet was contained. But this was not a war Britain could win by naval power alone. The expeditionary force, initially 80,000 strong, was dispatched to France under Sir John French, joining the French army in halting the German advance at the Marne in September 1914. The War of Maneuver quickly degenerated into stalemate, and Britain was drawn into the attritional struggle of the Western Front. The scale of mobilization was staggering. Over the course of the war, more than 8 million men were recruited or conscripted from Britain and the Empire. From India came over 1 million soldiers, who fought not only on the Western Front, but in Mesopotamia, Gallipoli, and East Africa. From Canada, 600,000 enlisted. From Australia and New Zealand, nearly 500,000 combined. From Africa, hundreds of thousands of porters and soldiers supported campaigns across the continent. The empire was no longer a backdrop but an active battlefield, its manpower and resources integrated into a single war effort. The campaigns illustrated both the reach and the strain of empire. In the Middle East, Britain moved swiftly to secure oil supplies in Persia and Mesopotamia, recognizing the growing importance of petroleum to naval power. In 1915, British and Indian troops advanced up the Tigris toward Baghdad, only to suffer a humiliating defeat and surrender at Kut in 1916. Eventually, reinforcements turned the tide, and Baghdad was captured in 1917. In Egypt, the Suez Canal was defended against Ottoman attacks, and by 1918 British forces under General Allenby had captured Jerusalem and Damascus, dismembering the Ottoman Empire. In Africa, German colonies such as Togoland, Cameroon, and German East Africa were contested, drawing imperial troops into prolonged campaigns in difficult terrain. Yet the costliest theater remained Europe. The Western Front consumed British lives and resources at a pace previously unimaginable. At the Battle of the Somme in 1916, Britain suffered nearly 60,000 casualties on the first day alone, a figure that seared itself into national memory. By war's end, over 700,000 British soldiers were dead, with nearly 2 million wounded. The Empire had fought and bled as never before. The financial burden was equally immense. The war was funded through a combination of taxation, borrowing, and credit extended by the United States. By 1916, Britain had exhausted much of its capital, selling overseas investments and borrowing heavily from American banks. The City of London remained a financial hub, but the war shifted the balance of economic power decisively toward the United States. For the first time in centuries, Britain ceased to be the world's principal creditor and became instead a debtor dependent on transatlantic loans. The long-term implications for imperial sustainability were profound. The war also strained the cohesion of the empire politically. While dominions rallied enthusiastically at first, divisions emerged. In Canada, conscription provoked sharp conflict between English and French-speaking communities. In Australia, referendums on compulsory service were defeated, revealing limits to imperial enthusiasm. In India, contributions of troops and resources were immense, but nationalist leaders such as Gandhi and Tilak used the war years to press for self-government, arguing that loyalty must be rewarded with reform. The empire held together, but at the cost of sowing the seeds of future demands for autonomy. At home, the war accelerated social and political transformation. The enormous demand for labor drew women into factories, transportation, and clerical work on a scale unprecedented, reshaping gender roles. Rationing, air raids, and conscription brought the realities of war to civilian life. The state assumed powers of regulation and control over industry, food, and propaganda, foreshadowing the modern interventionist government. By the war's conclusion in November 1918, Britain stood among the victors, but victory was Pyrrhic. The empire had expanded formally. Mandates over former Ottoman territories in Palestine, Mesopotamia, and East Africa were awarded under the League of Nations, extending Britain's reach into new regions. German colonies in Africa and the Pacific were divided, many falling under British dominion. On paper, the empire was larger than ever, but the reality was less triumphant. The war had drained Britain of wealth, indebted it to America, and cost the lives of nearly 1 million soldiers. The Dominions had fought valiantly, but had also asserted their identities. Canada's capture of Vimy Ridge, Australia's ordeal at Gallipoli, and New Zealand's sacrifices on the Western Front became national legends, fueling pride distinct from Britain. The First World War thus marked a hinge in the history of the empire. It demonstrated its capacity to mobilize men and resources from across the globe in a common struggle, but it also revealed the strains of distance, diversity, and debt. The empire had emerged victorious, but not unscathed. It was no longer the unquestioned master of global finance, nor could it assume automatic loyalty from its dominions and colonies. The war had both solidified and unsettled the imperial order. The next generation would discover just how fragile that order had become. In the interwar years, Britain struggled to balance commitments to empire with economic weakness at home, while nationalism surged in India, Ireland, and the Middle East. The empire of 1919 was larger than that of 1914, but also more brittle. The First World War had saved the empire from defeat, but in doing so, it had set it on a path of inexorable transformation and eventual decline. The British Empire emerged from the First World War larger than ever before, its dominions stretching over former Ottoman lands in the Middle East, German colonies in Africa, and vast territories already established in Asia. Yet the expansion concealed fragility. Economic exhaustion, staggering war debts to the United States, and growing nationalist agitation in India and elsewhere undermined the foundations of imperial rule. The interwar decades saw repeated efforts to balance overstretched commitments with declining resources. By 1939, the empire still covered 1/4 of the globe, but its capacity to defend itself was narrower than at any point since the 17th century. The Second World War would expose those limits brutally, transforming Britain from a global hegemon into a dependent ally and accelerating the empire's disintegration. The origins of the conflict revealed Britain's precarious position. The rise of Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan challenged Britain simultaneously in Europe, the Mediterranean, and Asia. Britain's leaders were acutely aware that the empire's defense was global in scope, but that resources were finite. The Royal Navy, still large, was stretched between the Atlantic, Mediterranean, and Far East. The army was small compared to continental forces, while the empire's air defenses were only just beginning to modernize. The 1930s policy of appeasement was shaped not only by memories of 1914, but by sober recognition that Britain could not fight everywhere at once. When war finally came in September 1939, the empire entered united, but dangerously exposed. The early campaigns were sobering. The fall of France in 1940 left Britain standing alone in Europe against Hitler. The evacuation at Dunkirk rescued 338,000 soldiers, but nearly all heavy equipment was lost. In the Battle of Britain that followed, The Royal Air Force repelled the Luftwaffe's onslaught, preventing invasion, but the cost in aircraft and pilots strained resources. At sea, German U-boats waged a relentless campaign against Atlantic convoys, threatening Britain's lifeline of food and raw materials. Once again, the Empire became Britain's shield. Canada provided wheat and ships, India sent troops, Australia and New Zealand guarded Pacific lanes, and African colonies supplied raw materials. The survival of Britain in 1940–41 was an imperial achievement as much as a national one. But the Empire's greatest shock came in Asia. In December 1941, Japan attacked simultaneously at Pearl Harbor, Hong Kong, Malaya, and the Philippines. Within weeks, the supposedly impregnable fortress of Singapore surrendered, with 80,000 British, Indian, and Australian troops taken prisoner. The loss was catastrophic. It shattered the myth of European invincibility in Asia and exposed Britain's inability to defend its far-flung possessions. Burma fell in 1942, cutting the land route to China, while Japanese forces threatened India's frontier. For colonial subjects, the spectacle of British retreat undermined legitimacy irreparably. Indian nationalists, led by Gandhi and the Congress Party, pressed harder for independence, while Subhas Chandra Bose organized the Indian National Army to fight alongside Japan. In the Middle East and Africa, the story was more balanced. British and Commonwealth forces under Montgomery halted Rommel's Afrika Korps at El Alamein in 1942, securing Egypt and the Suez Canal. Control of North Africa opened the path to Italy and safeguarded oil routes. In East Africa, Italian advances into Kenya and Sudan were reversed, restoring British control by 1941. These campaigns revealed the Empire's capacity to mobilize troops from across its dominions. Indian divisions fought in North Africa and Italy, South Africans served in East Africa, and Canadians stormed the beaches of Sicily and Normandy. The Empire remained a military reservoir, but the price was growing nationalism. Dominion governments demanded greater say in strategy, while colonial troops returned home more conscious of their role and sacrifices. Financially, the war drove Britain to the brink. Even before American entry in December 1941, Britain relied heavily on U.S. credit. The Lend-Lease program, initiated in 1941, provided vast supplies of food, arms, and ships, but it entrenched dependence. Sterling reserves were depleted, overseas assets sold, and by 1945 Britain faced debts exceeding £20 billion. The Empire, once the world's creditor, had become reliant on Washington. This dependence would shape the post-war order decisively. The war also transformed the dominions. Canada became an industrial power in its own right, producing aircraft, vehicles, and munitions. Australia and New Zealand, threatened directly by Japan, turned increasingly toward the United States for security. India, providing over 2 million soldiers, the largest volunteer force in history, was drawn deeper into the machinery of war, but also closer to independence. Promises of reform and self-government were made, but nationalist impatience grew. The Quit India movement of 1942 signaled that the war had accelerated, not deferred, the demand for freedom. By 1944–45, Britain had helped achieve victory on every front. D-Day in Europe, the reconquest of Burma, the collapse of Germany and Japan. Yet the cost was clear. The Empire was victorious but exhausted. Singapore and Hong Kong were recaptured, but their fall had permanently undermined imperial prestige. The dominions had fought with distinction but emerged more autonomous, their sacrifices reinforcing national identities separate from Britain. India's loyalty during the war made independence impossible to deny. Across Africa, returning soldiers questioned the legitimacy of colonial rule. At the war's end in 1945, Britain's empire was formally intact and larger still with the occupation of enemy territories. But the reality was starkly different. The country was bankrupt, reliant on American loans and aid. Its colonies were restless, demanding reform or independence. The United States and the Soviet Union had emerged as superpowers, their influence dwarfing that of London. The empire had fought the Second World War as a great power. It emerged as a junior partner in a bipolar world. The irony was sharp. The Second World War was fought in the name of freedom against fascism, yet Britain had defended an empire of subject peoples. The contradiction was not lost on colonial nationalists. The war demonstrated both the empire's vast mobilizing capacity and its fatal vulnerabilities: overstretch, economic exhaustion, and political illegitimacy. Victory in 1945 was thus the beginning of dissolution. Within 2 years, India and Pakistan would gain independence, beginning the great wave of decolonization. What had seemed the pinnacle of imperial endurance was, in truth, the final act before collapse. When the guns of 1945 fell silent, the British Empire stood bloodied, but not yet broken. On paper, it remained vast. India still under the crown, colonies stretching across Africa, mandates in the Middle East, and possessions in Asia and the Caribbean. Britain had fought and won a global war, yet beneath the victory lay exhaustion. The financial burden was crippling, the economy in ruins, and reliance on American aid total. The contradiction was stark. Britain had defended its empire through sacrifice, but the war had also destroyed the means of sustaining it. What followed over the next half-century was a retreat as rapid as its rise had been long, a dismantling of authority that transformed the empire into a commonwealth of sovereign states. The first and most decisive step came in India. By 1947, the jewel of the empire was no longer governable. The Quit India movement during the war had exposed nationalist impatience, and the British Labour government elected in 1945 recognized that repression was both morally indefensible and practically impossible. Negotiations with the Indian National Congress and the Muslim League yielded partition. India and Pakistan were granted independence in August 1947. The transfer was rushed, boundaries hastily drawn, and the result catastrophic. Communal violence claimed hundreds of thousands of lives, and millions were displaced in one of the largest migrations in history. Yet despite the turmoil, the withdrawal was irreversible. The empire's foundation stone had been removed. The example of India reverberated across the globe. In Southeast Asia, Britain attempted to restore control over Burma and Malaya, but the tide of nationalism was unstoppable. Burma achieved independence in 1948, followed by Ceylon the same year. Malaya remained within the empire until 1957, but its path was marred by communist insurgency, fought with brutal counterinsurgency campaigns. These conflicts demonstrated that Britain could still deploy military force, but they also revealed the limits of will and resources. The imperial system was being unpicked faster than it could be patched. In the Middle East, the contradictions were equally sharp. Britain retained mandates over Palestine, Transjordan, and Iraq, as well as strategic bases in Egypt and the Gulf. But nationalist movements and geopolitical realities soon overwhelmed imperial designs. In 1948, Britain terminated its mandate in Palestine, unable to reconcile Jewish and Arab claims, and the State of Israel emerged amidst war. In Egypt, the Suez Canal remained under British control until the crisis of 1956, when Nasser's nationalization of the canal provoked an Anglo-French-Israeli invasion. The operation, launched without American support, collapsed under US and Soviet pressure. The humiliation at Suez exposed Britain's reduced status. No longer a superpower, it was now a junior partner dependent on Washington. For many historians, Suez marked the symbolic death of the empire as a world power. Africa, long peripheral to Britain's imperial imagination, became the central stage of decolonization in the 1950s and 1960s. Nationalist leaders in the Gold Coast, Nigeria, and Kenya mobilized for independence, drawing strength from wartime service and post-war promises of self-determination. Ghana emerged as the first sub-Saharan colony to achieve independence in 1957 under Kwame Nkrumah. Nigeria followed in 1960, then Tanganyika, Uganda, and Kenya. The process was not always peaceful. The Mau Mau uprising in Kenya during the 1950s exposed the violence beneath the veneer of orderly withdrawal, as detention camps and counterinsurgency operations revealed the brutality of late colonial rule. But the momentum was unstoppable. By the mid-1960s, most of Britain's African colonies were independent. Elsewhere, the pattern was similar. In the Caribbean, colonies achieved self-government step by step. Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago in 1962, Barbados in 1966, and others thereafter. In the Pacific, Fiji, Papua New Guinea, and smaller territories followed. The empire of red on the map receded rapidly, replaced by a patchwork of new flags and sovereign states. Britain attempted to bind them together through the Commonwealth, a voluntary association affirming shared history and institutions. For some, it worked. India remained within it, as did many African states. For others, the connection was more tenuous. Still, the Commonwealth became the framework for Britain's transition from ruler to partner. though the asymmetry in wealth and power remained stark. The retreat did not mean disengagement from the world. Britain remained a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, retained nuclear weapons, and aligned itself firmly with the United States in the Cold War. Bases in Cyprus, Gibraltar, Diego Garcia, and Singapore preserved a reduced but still significant global presence. Yet the days of unilateral imperial command were gone. Where Britain once imposed its will, it now sought alliances, influence, and trade. The final symbolic moment came in 1997, when Hong Kong, held since the Opium Wars of the mid-19th century, was returned to China. By then, the empire was long gone, but the handover encapsulated its arc, from conquest and coercion to reluctant retreat. The Union Jack was lowered, the People's Republic of China resumed sovereignty, and Britain's 4th-century imperial story reached its end. The collapse of the British Empire was thus both rapid and complex. Between 1947 and 1970, Britain relinquished most of its major colonies. Some transitions were negotiated, others forced by insurgency, but the trajectory was consistent: retreat. The causes were multiple: financial exhaustion, military overstretch, nationalist resistance, and the rise of new superpowers. Yet beyond the mechanics lay a deeper irony. The empire had justified itself on claims of progress, order, and civilization. In the end, it was those very ideals, invoked by colonized peoples, that undermined its legitimacy. What remained was a legacy of paradox. The empire had spread the English language, legal institutions, and parliamentary models, but it had also left scars of violence, partition, and exploitation. It had built railways and ports, but often for extraction rather than development. It had proclaimed liberty while ruling subject peoples without consent. Its collapse did not erase its imprint. Rather, it scattered it across continents. From its rise as a maritime power in the 16th century to its fall in the late 20th, the British Empire had shaped the modern world more profoundly than any other polity. At its peak, it ruled 1/4 of humanity. Within a lifetime, it yielded that dominion. The speed of its retreat was as astonishing as the scale of its expansion. What had taken centuries to build dissolved in decades. The empire did not end in a single event, but in a long, uneven retreat, punctuated by war, negotiation, and compromise. By the century's close, it had become history, remembered in monuments, contested in memory, and embedded in the structures of a world it had once commanded.